This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you by Language Blend, the new best way to learn Spanish. Language Blend focuses on what you actually need to live and get by abroad with daily one-on-one lessons, a dedicated texting partner. It's like living in a Spanish-speaking country without ever leaving home. Go to languageblend.com for more information.
Yeah, so I've had a sort of an inside track on a handful of these negotiations. And there's really a lot of different ways these zones come about. There's a whole bunch of different sort of origin stories. The simplest case is the Sharpie on a map model, where there's some government bureaucrat that takes a Sharpie, draws on a map, and decrees, this will be a special economic zone.
Welcome back to another episode of the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. My guest today is Thibault Serlet. He's the co-founder of the Adrianople Group, a business intelligence company focused in special economic zones, also known as SEZs. Thibault led the creation of the Open Zone Map, the world's first comprehensive atlas of every special economic zone in existence. He's an absolute expert in this domain. And he's also friends with Francisco Litve, who some of the audience might remember as a previous podcast guest. Thibault, welcome.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to speak with you. I've listened to quite a few of your interviews, and I learn a lot every time I hear you speak. So I know that the audience is going to get a lot of value out of this episode as well. At My Latin Life, I think we're really pushing the boundaries in a lot of ways in terms of sort of like sovereignty and learning about sort of the dynamics of different countries. And I know that that's a particular interest of yours. You've said that you are interested in the fringes of global governance. And I wanted to know what kind of got you into this space, what got you fascinated about special economic zones and learning about the fringes of global governance.
Well, a number of years ago, I met a professor who was the son of Milton Friedman called David Friedman, and had dinner with him a few times. I was 17 years old, and he explained to me how different government was in the Middle Ages, and how just going back 500 years ago, we lived in a completely different world. There were republics that held their elections via lottery, because the idea was that God would pick the winner ultimately, so you could theoretically, have a candidate with one vote win. You had
I like that.
theocracies, governments that were bishoprics. Entire countries were bought and sold by business people who then became the heads of state. We're not talking about like lords buying it. We're talking, literal merchant kings. There were merchant guilds that owned, trading ports all across Europe. And it really got me going on a 10-year-long journey where I've been reading a lot about governance in general as a hobby, looking into types of government that are very, very different and very distant from what we have today. And at the same time, professionally, I've been attracted to special economic zones because, for the most part, they're just humble business parks. But they have these various governance reforms, and they're a very effective tool in the modern global economy.
Mm-hmm. And for some reference in terms of how widespread special and economic zones are, I believe I heard you say that there's over 5,000 SEZs that you have charted on your map, and
Yes.
there's probably another 7,000 that are kind of difficult to chart.
Yes. So we published Open Zone Map. It's the world's first comprehensive database of every SEZ on the planet. It's by far the best data set that exists out there. and our data is it's completely free, so anyone can download it and use it, and it's used by just about everyone. It's I've been contacted by a major university in China because apparently the Chinese government does not know where its SEZs are. So they were actually making a map for the Chinese government and using our data as the source, which is very amusing. But we were also contacted by the US government for exactly the same reasons of the global economy. We've been
Mhm.
contacted by uh, professors, the World Bank, UNCTAD, UNIDO. So basically, it's the global data set for special economic zones. Um, so what we found is that if you were to look at business parks that have multiple businesses, not just a single factory, that have these incentives that are attached to it that allow it to operate legally independently, there's about 5 to 6,000. The number kind of fluctuates depending on when you look at the map and so forth. However, there's a lot of single factory operations. I estimate probably another 5,000, 6,000 single factories on top of the 5 or 6,000 that we have recorded. And I'd estimate maybe another 2 or 3,000 of what I'd call briefcase zones. So, what's a briefcase zone? We were invited to try to set up a special economic zone for a mining company in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We ended up doing some due diligence and
Mhm.
turning down the lead because we thought it was too sketchy. And what it turns out is that there are 700 so-called briefcase zones in the DRC. These are zones that have a PO box or an address in an office suite. A company is incorporated there,
Mhm.
but the zone is like the size of a room and exists basically for money laundering or other shady purposes. So it's really impossible to count how many SEZs exist, but what can be inferred is that they play a significant role in the global economy. I've spoken to various economists at groups like the World Bank. The lack of data for now, we're working on it, but for now, the best you can do is some back of the envelope math. And the low end estimates are that 40% of manufactured goods in the planet are made in SEZs, and the high end estimates is at something like 60%.
Wow. I realized that it was significant, but I think people don't understand the scale of how significant it is. And I think you intuitively might think that a given country has maybe one or two economic zones, but it can often be orders of magnitude greater. I think the Philippines has 300 to 400. You said the Congo has hundreds. Um, what regions and what countries is this most common in? Because I know you've talked about how Europe, they've grandfathered a couple in, but Europe doesn't really have too many. North America doesn't have too many. Could you kind of give us like the global landscape?
Yeah, so the dots on my map can be a little bit deceptive because there's a lot of like very boring, import export type of things in Europe and America that barely even count as zones. We hesitated if we should include, for example, urban tax break zones in France, and decided to include them for various reasons. But anyways, half of the world's special economic zones are in China. There's something like 2,500 in China, um, and depending on your economic estimates, if you look at China's GDP growth from the beginning of the opening up era in 1978 until about the year 2000, something like 70 or 80% of China's GDP growth was based out of its special economic zones. And now it's a little bit less. But it's still close to 50%. So you have countries, like China, where these SEZs basically are the capitalist economy in an otherwise centrally planned, broader context. So there's many fascinating anecdotes out of China in terms of where else they're located. Well, what you find is that in the Middle East, you have a handful of very large government zones that are like funded by the state, that are huge, have billions and billions of dollars. What you find in LATAM, in the Dominican Republic, and in Colombia is that their legislation allows private companies to incorporate free zones. So you have hundreds of tiny business parks, some of which are single factory operations. So in Colombia, there's something like 150. In the Dominican Republic, about 100. The
Wow.
Philippines, they're also sometimes private, 300. Vietnam, India also have similar systems. So it really varies quite a bit. But if you were one good metric that doesn't yet exist, but I want to create someday, is zones as a percentage of national economy. And I'm sure that if you were to look at that, you'd find that in some countries like the Philippines, it's close to half, whereas in the U.S. it's like 1%.
hmm So that gives us a good sort of overview about how this isn't specific to any one region. It's everywhere from Latin America to Asia to Africa to the Arab regions of the world as well. So it's a little bit everywhere, and I imagine different regions have a different take on it and do it slightly differently. But before we get into too much detail, probably specifically about Latin America, I'm sure we'll cover we'll put specific emphasis on in this episode, kind of the different regions and zones that they have in Latin America. But I actually wanted to take things all the way back to the origins of these zones because, Thibault, I learned that you're a little bit of an expert in the history of how these zones came to be. In your words, going all the way back to Alexander the Great in through medieval France and the Italian Renaissance. And I was hoping you could kind of give us a little bit of a history region about how special economic zones came to be. And I guess there's probably a more primitive term, right? Sort of like a trading city state. I don't even know. But yeah, can you kind of walk us through how this idea sort of has grown over time?
Sure. So the word special economic zone only is from 1980. The word special economic zone was first used in China, and because China's zones did so well, everyone else started using that word. And now it's actually going out of fashion. Um, they've gone by many names, but the concept is fundamentally the same. You have a little chunk of a country that has different rules. So going into the distant past, all of the original governments were city states, right? It's a country that's the size of a city and maybe a few fields around the city. You can think about, Venice or Athens, or there's a very famous ones, or Sumer or whatever. Um, these are not special economic zones, right? What happens is that over time in history, you get all of these empires that sort of centralize and that create these more centralized systems that extend over larger geographical areas. As soon as you get the emergence of these empires, they start immediately having economic drawbacks. They start facing what Hayek described as the central planning problem, where a handful of government officials, in Rome or in Baghdad or whatever, have a very hard time managing the economy of such a large territory. So the solution
Mm-hmm.
that many empires have independently invented is to create artificial city states that exist within the context of a broader empire. And here are a few examples that I don't believe I've talked about too much on different podcasts. So one particularly interesting one is the Abbasid Caliphate is a particularly interesting early Islamic empire. It's the first real sort of technologically advanced, militarily powerful, and highly centralized Islamic state. Its heartland is Iraq. Its capital is Baghdad. However, it controls a good chunk of the Arabian Peninsula. Its eastern border goes into modern day Pakistan, and its western border extends into Egypt. It's roughly the same size as the old Roman Empire. It was around sort of 700 AD to 900 AD. And after 900 AD, there were people that had the name Abbasid caliphs, but for all practical intents and purposes, it was gone. The Abbasids had a very strong Christian neighbor, and that was the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire controls Anatolia, or modern day Turkey, modern day Greece, and a good chunk of the Balkans. And they were sort of the remnants of the Romans, and they're Christians, and they're the rivals of the Abbasids. The Abbasids would eventually beat out the Byzantines through a very clever strategy. It's a strategy that uses a type of city state called a thugar. So there's this desert border in between the Abbasids and the Byzantines in what's nowadays Syria and eastern Turkey. They're these very rugged, desertic regions. The Byzantines have this problem because all of the peasants leave. Why? Because it's a border area. There's constant war. Nobody wants to have their farms burnt down. So as a result, the Byzantines have to basically force peasants to stay. They create these military little like outposts, and the Byzantines struggle to protect and to control their border. What the Abbasids do is that they create a classification called frontier city, Thugar or Thigar. I have a very
Hmm.
hard time pronouncing it. And what they did is that
Okay.
they take a dozen fortified outposts and surrounding lands, and they tell people, hey, you'll be exempt from all of the normal laws against usury, where you Muslims cannot do interest-free loans. You will have a 0% tax rate. Um, it's not an income tax back then; it's more of a head tax. Um,
Like
and
on
you'll have
trading, like they're trading wool and silk and stuff like that, and it's just tax free. It's like a free
tax
trade
free,
zone.
but also
Yeah.
loans on interest, right, which are forbidden in Islam and in Christianity at this time.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
the Muslims allow that. They extend religious freedoms, and they basically take what is this garbage land that is constantly at war and give it enough privileges that a whole bunch of economically disadvantaged people basically flock there and create very permanent military cities. The most famous figure is Damascus, which will eventually be a major city throughout history and will play major roles. And as a result of this system, their borders are just constantly jam packed full of people who are doing trade, who are doing business. And yeah, these places are getting raided, but it's just a cost of doing business. And we know the result, right? Today, all of Anatolia is Muslim speaking. The Byzantine Empire would completely collapse, and Islam would be suitably entrenched in that region for centuries to come. So that's one example of how special economic zones and this type of ideas have had really significant, important geopolitical impacts.
Hmm. That's crazy. So you're almost telling the story of the foundation of Damascus as a sort of free trade zone that sprouted up.
Well, yeah, on top of an older city that kind of already existed, but let's call it modern Damascus.
Hmm. Where's the line between just a jurisdiction with, a slightly better, more favorable tax rate and like a full sort of comprehensive special economic zone?
Right. So let's fast forward a bit to the present, because it's a bit harder when looking at history. So a special economic zone, broadly speaking, or an economic zone, broadly speaking, is an area that has different rules and regulations. You have free trade zones where the only difference in the rules and regulations pertains to something relating to international trade. Usually, these zones are outside the customs area, which means that suppose you're making a car, right? You have a steering wheel from Germany, you have wheels from South Africa, and you are in China. You assemble the car from all of these parts. The goods don't pay a tariff when entering, and if the car gets sold in China where it's being built, it gets taxed. But if the car then gets re-exported to the U.S., it doesn't get taxed in China, right? So that's export processing zones or free trade zones. And some on top of this, remove things like the VAT. Some on top of this remove things like the import. They allow to write off import costs and your other taxes, and that's free trade zones. There's thousands of these. The next level are special economic zones, which are free trade zones plus, which also have some form of other tax breaks and other regulatory exemptions. The most common ones are mandatory arbitration, where all contracts have to be adjudicated in like private courts, basically, that aren't run by the government. You have exemptions from labor laws for all sorts of reasons. Frankly, some of these zones are sweatshops, but there's also very mundane, normal reasons why you want to be exempted from them, where sometimes you have to hire, like in Chile, 13% of your workforce has to be Chileans, which can be very annoying for certain
Hmm.
types of companies. So zones can be exempted from that, or they can give visas to bring in experts and stuff like that. So another type of thing that they do is they have one-stop shops where they consolidate all their government permits and stuff into one single place. So that's sort of the special economic zones. And then
Right.
there's sort of a
So
third level.
if I had to summarize it, just
Sure.
before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I guess the idea is it's a mix of economic and legal incentives, would you say, or bureaucratic or lack of bureaucratic incentives? So
Yeah, I'd say
there's
it's
sort of a
always economic incentives, always that. Yeah.
Mhm. But it's like not just economic. It's sort of where economic incentives also meet a separate set of incentives that you might call labor incentives or legal jurisdiction incentives, that kind of thing.
Yes. Yes, yes. What differentiates a special economic zone from, say, a Native American reservation is that they're given these incentives specifically for the purpose of generating economic development. Whereas, like, there's other areas that have these incentives, but just sort of as a historical accident, I don't know, the Lakota Nation within the U.S. or Tatarstan within Russia or the Catalonia within Spain and all of that.
hmm No, I'm pretty familiar with it as a Canadian. We have our native reservations where you can get your gasoline and tobacco tax free. So, but it's not really like encouraging economic development for like foreigners to come in and conduct business. So, um, interesting distinction. Before we kind of continue to bring it to the modern age, I know you want to talk about China and tell us the story about sort of the modern age, sort of 1980s and forward. But I also wanted to just ask you about sort of the, I guess you'd call it like colonial era, where you had the Portuguese and the Dutch model, and I guess even sort of like colonial China, where you had sort of the opium trading, and you had the British sort of trading ports along the coastal areas of China. So there must have been some sort of development from the Dutch to the Portuguese and perhaps the Spanish in Latin America, that sort of that sort of filled the gap between the Italian Renaissance to the modern era.
Yeah. So the Italian during the Italian Renaissance. Let me go a little bit backwards. Um, the Italians and and all of these Mediterranean traders developed these Porto Franco or free ports. And what these
hmm
ports were is that they were these untaxed areas that were far from Italy. So the Venetians would have one of these Venetian merchant outposts, for example, on the coast of Hungary, in modern day Croatia, or the Genoese had one of these in Crimea, a hotly contested area of modern day Ukraine. And what they would do is that these areas would be tax free, but would follow Genoese law, despite being very far from Genoa. So during the age of exploration, when the Europeans began exploring the world, the first colonies were not set up as these insane genocidal experiments in imperialism. The first colonies were very much within the tradition of these Italian free ports, just being done elsewhere. So in terms of colonial models that really followed that type of tradition, you have the Netherlands, at least at first. Later on, it becomes, very demented, and the Portuguese at first. And what the Portuguese are doing is that they want to trade with the Middle East. But to go through the Mediterranean, you have to deal with some highly aggressive and hostile Muslim powers, notably the Mamluks and the Ottomans. So their solution is to go around Africa and to come up on the other side and to trade that way. The Portuguese aren't Africa isn't like some primitive vacuum. This is a total historical misunderstanding. Africa, Southern Africa, South Africa, and Namibia, and sort of those parts of Africa are totally wild and don't really have any civilization. They're basically hunter gatherers. But a lot of other parts of Africa have some very technologically advanced and sophisticated civilizations. Notably,
hmm
going downwards, you have the Sultanate of Morocco, a very powerful Muslim state. Below Morocco, you have the Empire of Mali, which is a mining and merchant state. They mostly mine salt, but also a little bit of gold that they trade. There's all of these coastal city states that are run by groups called like Benin and Benin, but they're not actually, they don't quite correspond to modern colonial borders of where you look at Benin today on a map, because those groups were actually moved by the colonists later on. And going down a little bit more in Nigeria, there are some more sort of advanced city states. There's Songhai, there's Kanem Bornu, there's Timbuktu. And on the other side of Africa, you also have advanced states, also Islamic for the most part. You have the Sultanate of Kilwa in
Zanzibar.
modern day Kenya. Yeah, Zanzibar is part of Kilwa, actually. Um, you have several pretty high tech, sort of by medieval standards, Somali city states, like the Sultanate of Ajuran and so forth. And then you get into, Ethiopia, right? So the initial Portuguese plan is to actually start purchasing islands and purchasing little trade depots from these existing African city states that they model off of the Italian Porto Franco. So they start establishing these. This is how they get, for example, Sao Tome, and which is a modern day country, and they eventually make it to South Africa. The first white people from Europe to end up in South Africa were the Portuguese before the Dutch ended up there. There it was basically empty, so they just sort of started building stuff from scratch. And then going up, they also had some trade deals with Kilwa where they were able to purchase more of these outposts. And finally, they also went to some of the Indian city states and they purchased Goa in modern day Western India. So that was and all of these city states, as part of the purchase agreements with these native peoples, would have a deal. Hey, we're going to follow Portuguese law. This will be part of the Kingdom of Portugal, but overseas. And for the most part, it was a mutually beneficial business transaction. Now, what would happen is that there'd be a totally different model of colonialism that would mostly be invented by the British, who would just go into an area and physically slaughter all of the native people and move them and conquer it to establish large state, not just like little city-sized trading outposts, but basically new kingdoms, in these conquered areas, and the Spanish model, which did something that was pretty similar. So this older, sort of more benign trade-based model of colonialism would not be able to compete with the more sort of imperialistic model of colonialism, which we typically associate with colonialism when we think about it today. And interestingly enough, the Portuguese and the British were actually quite hostile to these city-states type of colonial ventures that were mostly purchasing based, because they viewed them as unfair and as cutting into their profits and as sort of creating tax havens where you didn't have to pay taxes to the British crown. So eventually, mostly due to pressure from other Europeans, these colonies will either be taken over, like in the case of South Africa, which would be taken over by the Dutch and later the British, or they would get, or it would push these groups to sort of adopt more aggressive postures, such as the Dutch, which would eventually sort of start militarily conquering what's modern day Indonesia to prevent the British and the Spanish and other groups from conquering those areas. So there would eventually be a race to the bottom, but that's sort of the middle stage. As for China, the treaty ports, it's that the Europeans wanted to sell a whole bunch of goods in China. Now we're moving on to the late 1700s. And China is controlled by a very strong centralized monarchy called the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty is dominated by a group called the Manchus, which are this ethnicity from northern Chinese. People say that they're steppe nomads, but that's actually not true. They were already sedentarized. And they have this total grip on China. And China has closed itself out to outside trade, specifically because they've seen these Portuguese and Dutch colonies in places like Japan and Indonesia and Vietnam. And they've seen how, once you let in a few Europeans, over time, the Europeans come to dominate your whole society. So because they have this large empire and they literally have hundreds of thousands of soldiers, they decide that they're just going to try to adapt and wait it out on their own. The Europeans don't like this. So the British create these highly concentrated forms of opium that they start smuggling into China to start doing illegal trade. Why? Well, because opium isn't super addictive in its herbal form, but when you start concentrating it and smoking it rather than drinking it as tea, the Chinese have been drinking opium tea for centuries with no problem. But the British start concentrating it and making products that are more similar to modern day morphine and heroin. And when they start pushing this into China, it creates enough of an addicted population that this group, to seek out more drugs, starts illegally trading with the British. When the Chinese Empire cracks down, the British conquer China. There's two opium wars that are fought. Other European powers that also wanted to trade with China, such as the Dutch, the French, and even the Americans, supported the British militarily. And as a result, these Europeans carve out what are called treaty ports. The Chinese literally to this day call this period the century of humiliation, and they call these treaties the unjust treaties. So it goes to show a little bit how lopsided they were. And these treaty ports were once again based off of the old sort of colonial Porto Franco sort of model, where you have your district that follows the law of your home country. This time now they're called international zones, except instead of being purchased from the Chinese, they were sort of militarily extracted out of them. And all sorts of horrible things go on inside of these treaty ports. A number of major coastal Chinese cities become these treaty ports. Some cities like Shanghai have actually 5 or 6 of these districts run by different European countries. There's a French district, a British district, and so forth, adjacent to one another. And ironically, this leads to two things. One is that it leads to China's economic development, and China develops the industrial base it will later need to kick out the Europeans. And the other is that it fuels this communist blowback, where the nationalists were basically okay with the system and were Western puppets. And it really is, Mao Zedong who successfully kicks out the Europeans from these treaty ports. And for all of Mao's problems and the fact that he killed many of his own people and was a pretty horrible leader, there's a good reason why he's well loved in China today, and it's that he brought an end to this sort of colonial exploitation of China.
Mm-hmm. And I think some listeners or maybe even detractors might look at these special economic zones around the world and make some sort of connection to colonialism and call this like, oh, this is just neo-colonialism. These zones shouldn't exist, blah, blah, blah. But of course, there's a lot of benefits to these zones. And even though it's inspired by these traditions, it's obviously a different thing. But I was just kind of curious your thoughts on sort of I guess that relationship.
Sure. Well, it's actually a critique that has a lot of merit, right? It's not a critique that's like totally irrational or emotional, but the truth is a little bit more nuanced. Some zones are created by what I would call sort of carpetbaggers, where they're these Americans who just like show up to an African country and want to create a zone, and those may or may not be a good thing. Sometimes they can be quite good, but those kind of are neo-colonial projects. But most of the successful zones, the ones that actually work, one common thing that you find amongst the good SEZs today is that they actually tend to be created by the people who live there to improve themselves and to trade with foreigners on their own terms. One of the reasons why China created the special economic zones under Deng Xiaoping was specifically to have treaty ports in reverse. The Chinese were thinking, hey, we're going to have treaty ports under, this 1978, but it's going to be us that are writing the terms, right? And we're going to be telling the foreigners what to do. And that actually was a much better system for the Chinese than the old colonial system. Or another example of this is the United Arab Emirates. And here there's a little bit of an example of how SEZs advance social policy. For all that we in the West, with the Western sort of Christian mentality, don't like hearing this, the people in the Middle East have their own culture, their own traditions, and this extends to things like certain blasphemy laws or prohibitions
Mhm.
on educating women. So what happened is that the UAE wanted to get European colleges and American colleges to go to Dubai, and the universities would only go to Dubai if they would encourage girls to go to school. So what the UAE did is that they said, "Hey, we're going to create these educational free zones." This is in the late '80s, and girls can go to school within these special economic zones, and we're going to do it on our own terms. So that's an example of social reform in a zone, but also of sort of a reverse colonial project. Same thing for the blasphemy laws. They created media free zones to get companies like CNN and sort of Western mainstream media companies to go there. Another
Mhm.
example that you find
Yeah.
is Colombia, where Colombia special economic zones to go into LATAM, totally created by one law firm of Colombians for the purpose of helping Colombia negotiate more fairly with the outsiders. So the truth is that SEZs can be neo-colonial, but they aren't always.
Mhm. No, Thibault, I think you did a good job of sort of transitioning the conversation into the conversation about China, and also pointing out how it is a turning of the tables in a lot of ways, where they've sort of these countries and groups have learned of the free trade zones of the past, and now they've done it in a way where they've sort of turned the tables and made it something that's more beneficial to the host country, right? So maybe now would be a great time. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to come back to the idea of how social economic zones actually are at the forefront of social change and sort of uh, social policies in a lot of way. You mentioned it on another podcast, and I thought that was very profound. So we'll put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it. But tell us a little bit about the construction of the modern era of special economic zones, and how maybe that started in China, and then the success of that, and how that sprouted from there.
So China was a Marxist Leninist state where doing business was very strictly punished. Um, if you were a Chinese citizen caught working for a foreign company, you could face, depending on which era, earlier on the death penalty and later on serious fines and imprisonment. Right? They weren't playing around. All private property was illegal, including things like cooking utensils. Right? So you couldn't even own pots and pans, let alone invest in industry. So people always ask, what's the secret to China's special economic zones? And the formula, you never want to repeat that formula, because the formula is have a population of 1 billion, close your country off for 20 years, have something like 50 million people die of famine, and then allow business in only 4 cities. Of course those 4 cities are going to get very big, right? So anyways, the special economic zones are a smashing success in China. They allow the Chinese to completely reform their economy, and a lot of emerging market countries decide to kind of copy the Chinese model. So there's sort of two waves of modern SEZs. The first is in the 1990s, about 15 years, mid 90s, after the Chinese have started their SEZ experiment. And this is where you get the 1996, you get free zones in Poland. 1997, you get the Philippines. 1998, you get Colombia. And around this time, you get the Dominican Republic. And they create all of these frameworks that are kind of loosely based off of the Chinese model. And they're all targeting manufacturing type industries. They're targeting the industries that China targeted in the beginning of its opening up. So plastic widgets, textiles, in some of the more heavy industrial cases, automotive parts, aviation parts. It's that type of manufacturing. And a lot of those zones themselves grew to be quite successful. And what happened is that there's this second wave of special economic zones that's really been happening since 2010, where a lot of people got quite wealthy during the late 1990s and early 2000s with these manufacturing zones. And recently, countries have been opening up a whole bunch of new zones targeting tech industries, office buildings, more sort of service oriented type of industries. And what's fascinating is that there's several different aspects of this new post 2010 wave of SEZs. One, it's that the Chinese have started explicitly exporting their model. They're saying, hey, well, if the Philippines are going to start SEZs anyways, might as well help them and get some of the benefits from that. So, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese government has funded, we have the only data set that really exists on this, something like 500 Chinese SEZs outside of China in places like Kazakhstan,
On the
Sri
Belt and Road.
Lanka, India. Sorry, what?
On the Belt and Road.
On the Belt and
So
Road,
it's
yeah.
like part of their Belt and Road strategy. So actually that's funny. So it's not just like they learned the SEZ model from the British, then they did it internally, and now they're doing it externally.
Yes. Yes, that's precisely what happened. And they're doing it externally, and they're doing it very well, right? So a lot of these SEZs are quite productive. There's some real troubled SEZs like the Golden Triangle, which would be an hour-long podcast for another day, so we shouldn't get into it. But some of these SEZs are making people very happy. Then, completely separate from China, there's another thing that's happened. And during the 1990s, the financing of special economic zone projects was kind of unclear. It was done much the way that traditional real estate was financed. But over time, some of these SEZ companies became quite large, and several of what could be loosely termed SEZ franchises have emerged. These are companies that started off with one zone, but now it's one private company that might have 50 or 100 privately owned SEZs, and they have billions of dollars. One of which is Adani Ports and Special Economic Zones out of India. Another is another Indian company called DLF, which both are now opening SEZs in LATAM as private sort of commercial ventures. You have DP World or Dubai Ports World. They have SEZs all over. Our team just visited one in the Dominican Republic. They have SEZs in Somalia. They have SEZs in places like, I forget which it is, but it's some South American country. You even have a couple of South American franchises that have appeared. You have eTech and Grupos AFB. You have a German company called VGP Parks. So you now have post 2010 at the same time as China, kind of for unrelated reasons, these like mega corporations, which now have enough money saved up from the 90s. So post 2010, this arms race has sort of began to start funding all of these special economic zones. And then to add fuel to the fire, there was this sort of libertarian US driven charter cities movement that appeared in the US. It's much older than that. The charter cities movement really, I'd say, gained steam and got serious money around 2016, 2017. There was a lot of people who were upset about Donald Trump who decided to invest overseas, which turned out to be really great. So for a kind of complicated, random series of reasons, the SEZ industry is accelerating. If I had to estimate, something like half of all of the new special economics of all of the SEZs on the planet have been built in the last decade. And the deal sizes for individual zones is increasing, where it used to be that zones, it's like, hey, we're going to raise, $40 million of debt capital to build an industrial park. Now, what you see is that there's IPOs that are raising tens of billions of dollars to build new cities. There's Iskandar Waterfront in Malaysia. That's a 1.2 or $1.3 billion sort of new city that's being built there. There's TRX City also in Malaysia. There's a new Malaysian stock exchange called TRX that's opening up, and they've raised $40 billion, this real estate company, to build a whole sort of smart city facility around the stock exchange. There's all the Chinese projects, some of which, like this tourism city in Antigua and Barbados, have budgets like $6 or $7 billion. There's the Saudi projects that have been getting a lot of media attention that have huge budgets and like the hundreds or of billions of dollars, but who knows if those projects are real.
Hmm.
But the so not only is the number of zones increasing, but the deal sizes is huge now.
Hmm. And so when you have these groups that are setting up SCZs all around the world in different countries, I guess they're working with the governments of these countries. They're approaching these countries and they're saying, "Hey, we have this idea for a new model and we think ultimately that your country will benefit from it. You simply have to allow us to basically make our own laws and probably give us a chunk of land as well." It must be an interesting set of negotiations that goes on.
Yeah, so I've had a sort of an inside track on a handful of these negotiations, and there's really a lot of different ways these zones come about. There's a whole bunch of different sort of origin stories. The simplest case is the Sharpie on a map model, where there's some government bureaucrat that takes a Sharpie, draws on a map, and decrees this will be a special economic zone.
Hey, everybody. Hey, everybody. Quick break from the podcast to tell you about Language Blend, the best new way to learn Spanish. Language Blend was co-founded by Jake Nomada, friend of the podcast, decade of experience in Latin America. And Jake and his team, they put everything into this program that they wish they had in terms of how to level up quickly with your Spanish language skills. Because the faster that you can get conversationally fluent in Spanish, the better the experience that you're going to have in Latin America. So go to languageblend.com for more information.
That's how a lot of the old Chinese special economic zones in the early 80s got created. The next model is sort of the indirect lobbying model, where ultimately there is a Sharpie on a map where some legislators just sort of like designate an area as a zone. But behind the scenes, there's actually like a lot of corporations, hiring politicians and lobbying, and there's some corruption. Um, but then there's some other models. There's some countries like in Colombia, a lot of the Latin American countries have a system where anybody who owns a certain amount of contiguous land, say 1 square kilometer, has more than 200 employees and meets other requirements, can apply on a case by case basis for that land to be exempt from various rules and taxes. So that's how SEZs and Colombia, Dominican Republic, and how all the maquiladoras sort of came about. There are models where the government wants to create zones. I was participating in some conversations with some officials from a small sort of tier two Middle Eastern country, which had this vacant land. They wanted to get it developed. It was basically a desert. So what they were doing was inviting American companies to see if any real estate developers would like build a privately funded SEZ. Actually, I've had that conversation with two Middle Eastern countries now. So that's another model. And then there's some really weird ones where there's like some slums in some countries that are just kind of doing their own thing and run by organized crime, and the government has no de facto control. So to get a semblance of control, they'll just kind of formalize pre-existing arrangements that exist by default. So there's a lot of these origin stories for SCZs that are quite different from one another, and it really has a huge impact on the outcome of the zones, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many different directions this thing is going. As you mentioned, everything from charter cities, which is relatively benign, to these sort of like supranational private corporations that are setting up in countries all over the world. It's definitely kind of in some ways, rings back to like the British East India Company and stuff like that, no?
Yes, it does, but it also, I think, rings back to something else. There's two other, I think, important parts of the big picture, what's going on right now. The first is the trend towards world government. And I know it sounds like a tinfoil hat paranoid thing, but let me explain. There's a model of conquest that's quite obvious, where you have an army that conquers another and establishes a government de facto. But there's another model, which is kind of the personal union model, which was common in the Middle Ages, where two countries slowly harmonize their rules and regulations until they just become one country. That's how Spain was formed out of the kingdom of Aragon, Leon, and Castile, and all of these sort of pre-Spanish kingdoms. They just kind of slowly homogenized rules and regulations, and over a few hundred years, without anyone kind of intending it or planning it, you just have a Spain appear. Or that's how France appeared, right? France would have been a bunch of duchies and stuff like that were, small city states that slowly homogenized. So what
Hmm.
you have today are various transnational bodies. You have the WTO. You have groups like the World Health Organization, a totally different field. And all of these bodies are putting out recommendations and guidelines for what they
Hmm.
think global government should look like. And a lot of these guidelines are non binding. But countries, for various reasons, will usually abide by these rules. Why? Well, here's an example. SEZs in Belize had taxes that were basically too low. Other countries said it was a tax haven. So the WTO sued Belize, and Belize got rid of their SEZ program. So that's an example of homogenization. Or another example is through something called UN Sustainable Development Goals, where the UN sponsors private think tanks to come up with model rules called Sustainable Development Rules. These rules are promoted by every corporation on Earth. Why? Because it's cheaper to lobby a think tank to pass this non-binding legislation than it is to lobby, 100 countries, right? And a lot of countries that want to ingratiate themselves with the UN, like Taiwan, which has partial recognition, or some very like sort of liberal places like Denmark for social reasons, will sort of voluntarily implement these sustainable development goals. So the first big trend is the trend towards world government, because these SEZs, true, they're taking power away from the nation state. But what you usually find is that they're actually kind of ahead in terms of implementing these supranatural guidelines, where UN and WTO and World Customs Organization and all of these groups have a huge influence on what actually ends up being in the rules of these new zones. So that's the first trend. And the other trend is precisely the opposite, where you've had several empires throughout history, the best example being the Holy Roman Empire, that have existed on paper, but eventually gotten so decentralized that their power disappears. So the Holy Roman Empire was actually Germany. It was not holy because it's where the Protestant Reformation originated. It was not Roman. It was based out of Germany, and it started, in 800 AD, a few hundred years after the Roman Empire disappeared. And it was not an empire. Why? Because over time, they gave more and more power to local officials, to the point where the emperor was purely symbolic. And it just became a collection of a few hundred completely independent city states. So SEZs represent both of these trends. And here's how I think it will play out. In regions that are not yet significantly homogenized, that don't yet follow World Health Organization and WTO and UN Sustainable Development Guidelines and World Bank policy papers, I think that in those areas, special economic zones are actually increasing the homogenization and are actually making these areas conform more closely to that type of regime. In other
Hmm.
countries, notably the West, special economic zones represent the opposite trend, where in the countries that are already more sort of deeply part of this global governance system that sort of de facto exists, SEZs are actually kind of tearing the system apart. Here's an example. The EU has a ban on special economic zones, and Viktor Orban of Hungary, sort of unilaterally against EU rules, decided to just create special economic zones last year, and sort of by fiat just exempt these zones from all sorts of EU regulations. And it's a huge lawsuit. But that's an example of how SEZs are dehomogenizing. Um, or another example is that post Brexit, the UK has been talking about making free ports that would have all of these ease of doing business type of regulations. And if they were ever to be implemented and to go beyond a thought experiment, that would also represent an anti-homogenization. So I think that the long-term trend for the next 50 years to 100 years is we're going to shift into a world government where, sort of by accident, through simply regulatory harmonization, and SEZs will play a major role in that shift, and that explains part of their proliferation. And in the much longer term, looking more like 100 years from now, SEZs will ultimately also be what tears apart that system of global homogenization and returns the world to a state that's more recognizable today. I hope that doesn't sound too insane, but it's a bit of historical speculation on my part as to what they represent in the long term.
Yeah, no, it's true. And we said we'd return to a pin about how SECs can actually advance social policies. So I'm guessing maybe in the Arab world, they're in some of the SECs, maybe they allow stuff with alcohol or the education of women or things like that. And you could see how potentially in different areas around the world, um, where the laws of the SECs are different than the laws of the larger country, uh, that can sort of progress the social policies and the social agenda in a different direction than might be the status quo in the country in which the SEC is based. Do you have some examples of that?
Yes, yes. Special economic zones are used all the time by governments to affect and change and reshape social policy. So, one example is Hong Kong, where after Hong Kong was handed back to China from the British to basically placate the population, the Chinese created a legal fiction that it was a special economic zone that would be separate from the rest of the country. One country, two systems. That was sort of the legal fiction. And now it's breaking
Hmm.
down and it has all of these serious ramifications, right? A lot of these Hong Kong protests are fundamentally about the fact that the special economic zone didn't offer enough autonomy from the Chinese because it allowed the Chinese to sort of sneakily take back whatever they'd given away. Another example, also from China, is Macau, which is a very similar situation. 2 years earlier, the Portuguese handed over Macau, like Hong Kong. It also got a special economic zone status. And Macau has some quirks where gambling is legal there, but is illegal in the rest of China, which matters
Hmm.
way more in Asia than it does elsewhere, because gambling has a very important role, especially baccarat in Asian society, that it doesn't really have in the West. Um, if you were to
Hmm.
look at some of the limited experiments with special economic zones that Europe has had, you actually have one example, which is with drug legalization. In Denmark, there is an old military base called Freetown Christiania, which was taken over by hippies and became a hippie commune. And what the Danish government decided to do is that instead of enforcing drug laws, they decided to basically stop enforcing drug laws within this hippie commune slash old military base. It's not a true special economic zone. You won't find it on a map. But for all practical
Right.
intents and purposes, it shows how you can test these social policies on a small scale and see if they work for larger scale implementation. And it turned out to be a success, right? Because within Freetown there were these planned injection sites, so there was less HIV that was spread through drug use, and people who were on drugs had kind of a safe place where they could go, so they weren't breaking into cars for drug money and stuff like that. It was sort of an example of successful drug legalization. um, on the drug legalization front, quite a few special economic zones. There's a very famous cannabis SEZ in Lesotho after South Africa legalized cannabis. Lesotho, to produce it legally without having to legalize it for their own country, but to still sell it to the South Africans, found a Canadian cannabis company that was pretty credible and basically sold a special economic zone to it. On the drug front here in Switzerland, not quite special economic zones, but Switzerland is one of the only countries, most people don't know this, where heroin is legal everywhere at the nationwide level. Switzerland has no drug problems whatsoever because what they did in the 1990s is that they told, okay, if you're addicted to heroin, the government will just give you a prescription for it. So at 1/4 the price of the black market. So it totally put an end to the black market. Addiction rates went down, and Switzerland is now very safe
Hmm.
in part because of that. But at first,
And
before the Swiss
there's
did
also
this,
another.
oh sorry, I was just going to say that
Go
there's
ahead, but
casino zones. Yeah.
there's and then Switzerland also has that Italian enclave where there's casinos.
Yeah, well, so Switzerland has casinos everywhere. They're kind of gambling is illegal, but they're approved on a case by case basis. I've been to the Italian enclave. It's not really that special. Yeah, gambling is basically de facto legal here, and there's casinos all over the place.
What are some of the most interesting economic zones? I had a note to ask you about that Lesotho weed one. Uh, I also heard you talk about the Pakistan gun zones.
Okay, so I have a good rule for talking about special economic zones, and I like to only talk about zones where one of my colleagues at the Adrianople Group has physically gone to. So I can't speak that much to the Lesotho one because we haven't sent anyone there yet, but are actually planning it.
I'm
Um,
sure. I'm sure they'd be down. Right,
oh,
that's a fun one. You get to visit the weed zone.
yeah, I'll be
I
sending someone.
digress.
Hopefully they'll be very responsible. Um, um, we're not sending somebody to the Pakistani gun zone. It's just too dangerous. It's. But what we did do is that we recently sent somebody to the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone. So actually, just 2 weeks ago, we sent somebody there. The Golden Triangle is by far the most risky zone visit we've ever done, and it's probably the most risky zone visit we'll ever do because the experience sketched us out so much that we are never going to do anything like that again. What it is that there is a zone in Laos. It's the zone is entirely within the country of Laos, but it's on the border of Laos with Thailand and Myanmar. And the zone kind of touches Thailand and touches Myanmar. It's the shape of a triangle, hence the name Golden Triangle. This zone was built by the Chinese in 2011 by not the Chinese government, but a private Chinese individual called Zhao Wei. Zhao Wei is a casino owner from Macau, but what he also is a known triad. Do you know what the triads are?
Yeah, sure.
They're these Chinese mobster type of people. Um, so this casino, what he did is that he created a casino-based special economic zone, and this zone is exempted from all normal police activities in Laos. The Laotian police cannot enter. There's kind of a wall around the zone.
And it's
Fifty
pretty big.
thousand
Three
people live
thousand
there.
hectares. I'm seeing.
What?
Hmm. It's pretty big.
It's huge. So it's something like 10 square kilometers. The zone, hard to tell. 50,000 people live there currently. That's an estimate that we made based on the number of buildings. There's no official census, but that's what we think it is. And it's basically it's a human trafficking hub. So it's one of the worst offenders in the world for modern day slavery. Based off of our physical visit and just looking at the buildings, you can see which buildings contain trafficked people because the buildings have bars on the windows to prevent the people from leaving and guards. And we estimate that something like 10% of the buildings in the zone contain trafficked people. So it's a city of slaves. There's three types of people who are trafficked there. The first are like migrant workers. It's kind of like what you hear about Dubai used to do. Dubai doesn't really do this too much anymore, but it's actually way worse. Where they'll go to Nepal, they'll find a bunch of young men who don't know anything. They'll take their passports, they'll lock them in this zone and force them to do manual labor and torture them and do horrible things, gouge out their eyes, just absolute horrible things. On top of this, there's also call centers. So if you have a US or a Canadian number, I'm sure you get these tech customer support scams 24/7. So they have call centers that run these scams, and the people who work in these call centers are actually enslaved. They don't have a say in the matter. And a third thing that they have is prostitution, including child prostitution. And when we were there, we sadly saw many brothels, some of which seemed like they had children inside of the brothels. So it's a very horrible zone. And then compared to the human trafficking, there's some other crimes which then seem pretty minor. There's wildlife smuggling of endangered species for Chinese traditional medicine. There are drug production, but once again, there's compared to the human trafficking, that's like, who cares? That's minor. Also, another thing that they do there that's pretty horrible: a lot of pollution, a lot of arms trafficking. They just completely just throw all their trash in the river. They also stole the land from the people who lived there. So the army just kind of went there at gunpoint, forced the people off their land. They did give the people new houses, but the new houses are in the zone, and the people who get the houses basically have to become are permanently in debt for the new houses and have to rent the houses from the kind of the Chinese mafia that runs the zone. So they also are serfs. So if you add the sort of in serf population to the slave population, it's huge. So there are some zones. It's an interesting zone, but it's probably the most extreme example I know of a zone that has human rights issues. We're putting out an investment advisory about it, and we're going to use the very strong language saying that it's the worst special economic zone on the planet.
Interesting. Yeah, this is a bit of an aside, but it really made me think of another related concept, which is the company town. So back in, let's say, like the early Wild West in the U.S., they would have the company town, right, where the general store was owned by the town, and maybe they'd pay you in like company money, like trinket money, instead of real national currency, and then you had to spend it at the company store, and it was basically like a closed ecosystem, right? And so in some ways, early company towns and special economic zones have some sort of overlap or share common origins.
Yes, they do, and there still are company towns today. Sinisterly enough, there's one in India that is a special economic zone that makes nothing but children's toys, like those plastic little stuff. I forget exactly which company
Hmm.
it is, but they literally use the word company town. But I actually know some people who've lived in some SEZ company towns who've worked for the Adrianople Group, and some of the company towns are quite bad, but some of them actually were quite nice. And our former employees who lived in these company towns told us that it was a pretty sketchy country. That these company towns were very safe, they were very clean, the schools were good, all the kids got a free education. So it was almost like some of these company towns really benefit the people who live there. It's a bit sterile, right? It's not like it lacks the charm of a city that evolved sort of more organically, but it allows for kind of a safe middle class existence for people who otherwise couldn't afford it. So the company towns vary quite a bit in terms of their nature. They're neither really negative nor positive. They're all over the place. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, they're definitely
So
connected.
what is the landscape of the oops, touched my mic there. So what is the landscape of the different types of economic zones? Because I know it can range from everything from technology parks to export processing zones to, and there's all these different names. So I mean, how many names are you aware of if you had to rattle them off?
Well, let me give me 1 second, because I'm actually gonna. I'm currently writing. It's gonna take me another year or two, a textbook on special economic zones. But I'll actually read you a section that I think you'll find quite interesting. Maybe we can edit this part out. Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, take your time.
Okay, I'm back. Okay, so here's what you have. So if you were to look at special economic zones, what you'd find is a wide variety of different physical appearances. Some SEZs are entire regions. We call these economic revitalization projects because they almost always are distressed areas, like areas with a lot of poverty. And it's just, however the region would normally look. Most are business
Mhm.
parks and most focus on manufacturing. You have office parks, you have like some shopping malls and some sort of touristic areas with hotels. You have some charter cities. A charter city is just a special economic zone that has a high degree of legal autonomy and a school and a permanent residential population. We include a school in our
Mhm.
definition because that means that there's like families that live there and there are people who are going to live there permanently. It's not just like some single men who are going to go work there for 5 years and send money home. So once you have 10,000 residents in a school inside of a zone, it becomes a charter city. Um, but perhaps the most interesting type of special economic zone are highly specialized manufacturing zones. And I'm going to read you something from my upcoming book, probably out in about a year or two. Industrial clusters, this is within China. All of these zones I'm about to read you the names of are all located within China. Are you ready?
Mhm.
Leather Shoe City. These are zones that make a single good. Leather Shoe City. Taizhou Low and Middle Pressure Valve Economic Development Zone. Wujiang Lubricating Industry Cluster. Yunfu Plumbing Equipment Production District. Yangjing Motorcycle Component District. Xinhai Lighter Cluster. China Casual Shoes Industry Cluster. Pinyang County Zipper Industrial District. Yes, zippers. Fuyang City White Paper Industry Cluster, Ningbo Household Appliance Export Processing Zone, Sock City, Sweater City, Guangzhou City Denim Garment Industrial Cluster, or Shenzhen's Electronic City and Vape Cluster. And some of these are huge in terms of their impact. Some of these very specialized zones. One of them, the Wenzhou Cigarette Lighter Cluster, uh, about 10 years ago, these are old stats, made 70% of the world's cigarette lighters. The Shenzhou Necktie Cluster, one industrial park, 30% of the world's neckties. And the Hengji Toothbrush Cluster, yes, there's a toothbrush cluster, 30% of the world's toothbrushes. So gives you an example of the scale of the manufacturing that goes on in some of these zones. And believe it or not, I actually have a whole chapter in this book that I'm writing just on the toothbrush cluster because it's so fascinating to look at the inner workings of one of these. So that's the world of SEZs. Any possible industry you can imagine has a zone that is adapted to it, no matter how specific or how niche. Somebody has realized,
Mhm.
hey, if we tweak our regulatory system to just be perfect to attract this type of businesses, it's going to take off.
And it doesn't have to be industry specific either, right? Like a lot of them are just sort of like free trade zones. Like for example, like the Cologne free trade zone in Panama. It's kind of a mix of all kinds of industries.
Yeah, so what you find is that over time, zones tend to develop more industries, but this is a double edged sword. I once was asked to consult on a project, and I'm not kidding. This is not satire. Here were the three industries that they wanted to attract into one zone. Are you ready? Waste
Hmm.
management, food processing, and tourism, all in one zone. So I just imagine the stinky pile of waste next to the potatoes being peeled, and the tourists just kind of holding their nose as they walk through this. What you find is that probably the number one problem with new special economic zones is that they don't really know what type of industries they want to target. So this is a big sort of issue, and I'd say it's actually a failure point. The most successful SEZs target a single industry at first, or like five or six kind of closely related industries. I don't know, car parts, car manufacturing, and airplane parts might go well together. Some combination like
Got
that.
it.
and then over
That's
time they
interesting.
tend to expand to other zones. So looking at it in the present, yeah, there are a lot of cities that are built that have like 20 industries, but in retrospect, you find that they almost always all the started with one zone due to the survivorship problem.
Hmm. And do you find that it's typically led by public sector officials that are sort of enterprising officials that want to bring change to their communities, or do you find that it's more businessmen that are looking for tax advantages and stuff? I guess ultimately it's a bit of a public private partnership, but who, like, on balance, who is leading the charge more often?
So we have data on who owns the special economic zone management companies. And it's like, if I remember correctly, it's 32% the government fully owns it, 31% the private sector fully owns it, and the others, like 36% public private partnerships. So it's almost perfectly one third wholly government, one third wholly private, and one third a mix of the two. What I found is that the government zones tend to be ADHD and like scatterbrained, and that the government zones try to target too many industries. They're like that zone I was telling you about, the waste management, tourism, and agro processing in one place was a sort of government driven initiative because it's the central planning problem, right? The bureaucrats don't really have they're not the ones who are going to be profiting from the construction of the zone, so they don't really have a financial stake to like choose the right industries. So what you find is that a lot of them are started by the governments, but those kind of don't do too well for the most part. There are exceptions, and they just kind of survive because year after year they just kind of take more money from the taxpayers in their country and end up being just sort of wasteful. Whereas the private zones tend to be smaller, like physically less hectares, right? But they tend to be more
Hmm.
specialized and they're actually quite successful. I think we had something like a 35% success rate for private sector zones, which for commercial real estate is very good. So
And do you find that these zones are often on a river or a body of water or train tracks at least, or like, you know what I mean? Because they're going to have to bring in raw materials and then they're going to have to export finished goods typically. And so at minimum, they're going to need like public roads, probably from the government of the country uh, beside it. But do you find that there's any patterns in terms of where these are often set up?
yeah, totally. So if you look at our map, what you'll find is that we actually have data on whether zones are ports, airports, and we don't have zoned data on railway stations. But what you find is that they're always, tied to transportation infrastructure, where they're always, by rivers, by airports, by railroads, by freeways, with the exception being office parks. There's a few sort of orphans that target industries that don't make sense, or there's like some very highly specialized manufacturing zones where they once again have a stranger transportation issues. But you're totally correct.
Hmm. I heard something on that you mentioned where a guy that's trying to visit every special economic zone in the world, something like that.
No, it's not special economic zones. It's startup cities, which is
Ah, okay.
cities that are being built by startups. In addition to our special economic zones map, we also have a map of startup cities, which we made for a Silicon Valley investor called Balaji Srinivasan, and to kind of accompany his book that he
Balaji,
published. Yeah,
the
Balaji. Yeah.
network state.
Uh-huh. That, yeah, exactly. So when he published that book, we made a map that kind of accompanied it. Um, so we have a guy who's trying to visit every single one of those. His name is Scott Bayer. He's an investor. He's independent. He's going on an 18-month long journey, and he's already finished Latin America. So he might make for a really good guest because he just did 6 months through all of LATAM, and I think now he's in Africa. Um,
What's
but
his name again?
Scott Bayer with market urbanism. I recommend him highly. He's quite interesting, and he will be doing an interview from one of these cities in Africa right now.
Interesting. Scott Bayer, market urbanism. Okay. Speaking of Latin America, by the way, you've been super generous with your time. We'll kind of try to get wrapping up, but we got to touch upon Latin America a little bit and just the landscape of SEZs in Latin America. I guess maybe a first opening question is there any way in which the Latin American special economic zones are unique or different from those that you might find in Asia or the rest of the world? Do the ones in LATAM perhaps have common characteristics?
Yeah, so there's several peculiar traits about the zones in LATAM. One, it's that they tend to be, there's some exceptions, by the way, to this, like Brazil doesn't fall in this paradigm at all, or Chile or whatever. But for the most part, the special economic zones tend to be very small physically. There aren't really any charter cities, the way that you find in India or China with like tens or hundreds of thousands of people living in them. They tend not to have that extreme of regulatory reform where on paper it's not like, oh, this zone is exempt from all taxes and all laws are dealt with in private court. The exception for LATAM are these ZEs in Honduras, but they're a bit of a mutant. They don't really, align with the rest of the continent. However, they tend to be profitable, right? Because they're small and they don't try to do too much. There's a lot of people making a lot of money off of these special economic zones there. Um, Another interesting trait is that many of them have informal deals with the government, where on paper, they don't really have that many interesting regulatory exemptions, but they're like run by people who know a guy who can get you a case by case sort of exemption from just about any rule or regulation. And that tends to be quite common. I don't really want to get anyone in trouble, so I'm not going to mention any countries. Um, but that's actually a very key part of the LATAM ecosystem. In terms of the places within LATAM where
There's a will,
zones,
there's a way in Latin America for sure.
yes, and that's actually I'd say the most unique characteristic of LATAM free zone. Um,
uh, Things are different if you know a guy. Classic Latin America. Sorry,
Another
please
thing is that
continue.
the corporate structure, there's some LATAM zones that are done by like VGP Parks and DP World that are these big multinationals from outside of LATAM. But a lot of these zones are kind of owned by a family, and these families don't really like keep track of their accounting very well. So they don't have any outside investors. They're entirely wholly funded by like six people who know each other. And some of these families own zones in multiple countries. One of the most interesting families that I interacted with that does this is called Grupo Guerrero. They're not shady, so I'm mentioning them by name because I know I can't get them in trouble. They actually run some ecological free zones that are negative net carbon in Costa Rica. One's called Green Park, but they also run zones, I believe, in Guatemala and Nicaragua, as well as random non-SEZ residential master planned communities in the U.S. So Grupo Guerrero is sort of the prototypical, but there's some other groups that are kind of like that, but a little bit shadier that run like zones because they own a factory and they're taking advantage of all of these like case by case exemptions, and they don't want anyone else to know that they've got this thing going on for them. So it's very hard as an outsider to invest in LATAM zones, not in the companies in the zones, but in the zones themselves, the way that you could in a bunch of other countries. So it's a very peculiar ecosystem. Um, I personally haven't really spent that much time in LATAM. I'm not a big LATAM guy, but a lot of we've done quite a bit of work as a company in LATAM, and we have a lot of colleagues like Francisco, who you interviewed, who are from Brazil. We have a lot of Hondurans who work for us. We've had people from other countries in Chile and Colombia work for us as well. So we're quite familiar with that whole ecosystem.
What do you think are some of the most exciting SEZs or projects in Latin America?
Um, None of the projects that I find super exciting personally are actually in LATAM. So I'm actually not going to answer that question. Here's the thing. Um, the whether or not an SEZ is there's a few SEZs that I could recommend that would be quite interesting if you wanted to say register a pharma business. I forget the name of the park because I wasn't the one who physically went there. One of my colleagues did, but it was in Uruguay, and if I remember correctly, it was like a biotech development park where you could get all of these benefits for doing pharma. There's another zone in uh, in um, in the Dominican Republic that has a lot of abilities to exempt people on a case by case basis, but it's more formalized, so it's not as sketchy as if you were to do it like in other countries. So that's quite interesting. There's a number of zones that have arbitration clauses. One of the most intriguing zones are the Honduras ZERES, of course, which you have to mention because these are zones that were initially built with this very free market sort of mentality in mind, but right now they're sort of having some conflicts with the local government over some legal issues. So their status is a little bit shaky, but they're definitely interesting from an academic perspective. And of course, the one that stands out in my mind as being the weirdest is, of course, El Salvador's Bitcoin City, which I'm sure everyone who's listening to this has
Mm.
heard of. I know that Brazil has had no SEZs for decades and has just passed legislation that allows for the creation of new SEZs. With the new government, it's not clear if that'll be overturned because that was a Bolsonaro era. But if it stays, Brazil will probably be a very interesting country. The most interesting countries, I would say, are Colombia, which just lost their tax benefits but have an otherwise very stable and developed ecosystem, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Brazil.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that Colombia actually has like 100 special economic
150?
zones, which I was surprised to hear.
Yeah, so Colombia started with a single government run export processing zone in the 1970s. In 1996, 1997, a law firm called Araujo Ibarra basically wrote new rules that were revolutionary at the time that allowed private companies to apply for zone status if they owned contiguous land. And on a basically a case by case, there was like a checklist of rules that companies can be exempt from on this land. And they got, within a few years, a handful of zones got something like 35% of all foreign investment into Colombia. And another advantage was that Colombia has a very serious problem with corruption. In the 1980s and 1990s, Colombia was sort of had all of these guerrillas and drug traffickers and was very dangerous. So the zones were really the only place where foreigners could safely operate. So it really had a huge impact. Araujo Ibarra co-founded a company called Grupo ZFB that was going to manage a single zone in Bogota called the Bogota Free Zone.
Mhm.
And they had this very interesting business model where once they set up a zone and the zone was full of the value of the land is next to nil. But when you add the incentives and you fill it up with tenants, the value of the land increased. So they then used this land as collateral to go into debt to finance the creation of another zone, right? Because suddenly they had an asset that they could put up to get a loan. And they did this again, where the cost of setting up a zone, once you have the land with no incentives and electrifying the site is low, the value of the land went up, which then increased the value of that new zone as collateral. And they did this something like 40 times, and they now run 40 zones in Colombia. And on top of that, Araujo Ibarra, the law firm that they work with, which I recommend talking to. If you want to do a business in Colombia, they are the people to talk to. They're not paying me for saying this. But they've set up zones that are separate from Grupo ZFB for like Coca-Cola and for Pepsi and for all of these big auto manufacturers. So
Mhm.
Colombia has some challenges with its legislation, but has behind it, a strong history of doing these things quite successfully and avoiding a lot of the problems that you'd find with corruption and compliance issues, etc.
Yeah. Have you ever considered setting up an SEZ yourself? Going raising some money, getting some land, talking to a government. Sounds like you kind of know the ins and outs at this point.
Well, that was actually my goal when I started the Adrianople Group. But I then saw so many people try and fail to set up their own SEZs. I've seen probably 50 people and I've consulted for maybe 20 or 25, right, of people who've tried to set up SEZs that I'd have to like leave Switzerland and just move there. It's very stressful. I don't recommend trying it. It's like ruined the lives of many people I know. I literally see their hair get gray. It's like the aging of presidents. I don't know how to describe it. I've seen it like totally takes over every aspect of their life. It's one of the hardest businesses to do. What I would consider doing though, and I'm very curious, is there's a lot of investment opportunities. If you're funding other people who are going to do the hard work, it's a much better prospect.
Yeah. And I know we want to get wrapping up, but damn, that's an interesting theme real quick. Like what would that entail, like funding an SCZ economic zone? How does one even get their money back? Is it like in rents? Like you're renting out factory space or something to businesses and then they're paying you, or how, like what's the economics of that business investing in SCZs?
Well, that's a very complicated question. There's a very complicated answer, but there's a handful of different business models that have been tried. And keep in mind, there are a dozen companies out there that do nothing but like finance SEZ. So there's already a fairly well developed SEZ finance ecosystem.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
the first business model is simply that they're going to charge rent on the land that they own that's within the zone, right? But then the question is, if you have a company that's charging rent on the land, how does the investor who owns equity in that company make money through an exit, right? They're not just going to like sit down and collect
Right.
dividends for 200 years, right? So what you find is that a lot of zones are publicly traded indirectly. Some zones have IPO'd on their own, like Phnom Penh SEZ in Cambodia, Tilawa in Myanmar. Adani Port and SEZ is a whole franchise that IPO'd. DP World IPO'd. So sometimes zones are IPO'd on their own. Iskander will IPO soon. Sometimes zones, the companies that own multiple zones have an IPO. Other times, what you find is that zones are packaged into REITs, real estate investment trusts, with a bunch of
Yeah,
other
I can see that.
assets. So, Blackstone, which is the big American, no, one second, let me not make a mistake. Um, it's BlackRock, which is the private equity fund. BlackRock invested a few $1 billion into Indian special economic zones. And their exit strategy was that they packaged these zones into a bunch of real estate trusts, along with a bunch of random properties that were not zones: hotels, shopping malls, ports, railway stations, just you name it. And these big packages were then IPO'd and sold on the stock markets. The biggest one of these packages is called Prestige Estates. And I think that package contains like a dozen SEZs, mostly within India. The Philippines has had a number of zone IPOs indirectly via these models. China has had several. A lot of these are publicly traded. It's very surprising, and some of which, if you trace the indirect listings, end up on big stock exchanges like New York Stock Exchange. Adani was part of New York Stock Exchange for a while. Um, in terms of who's funding them, well, you have this sort of internal ecosystem, but you now have more traditional real estate private equity funds that I know have invested quite a bit in SCZs. Some have done so directly, like Warburg Pincus, 3i out of the UK, and have just bought shares in zones and exited, and others
Mhm.
like KKR have been investing in these REITs that kind of contain the zones at an intermediate stage. Um, I, I could go into more detail, but I'm afraid that we're the only company on the planet that actually has extensive data about the IPOing of special economic zones. We're literally the only people in the world who have the data, and it's one of our most prized possessions. So if any of your listeners want to discuss it with me, I'd love to, but it's a paid. That's something I can't really discuss publicly yet. Although my ambition in a
I
couple
like
of
it.
years is to
Upsell.
actually make all the data public. So just wait and see for
Mhm.
that.
Guys, well, no doubt Thibault's knowledgeable, so we'll come back to this at the very end of the episode, how to get in touch with Thibault. One or two last quick questions. So, burning question I have is, like, if you were to start a company, I guess basically anywhere on the planet at this point, especially if it was a manufacturing type company, why wouldn't you just always do it in an economic, a special economic zone if you had the opportunity? You know what I mean? If you're gonna start a anything, I don't know, steel company, pharmaceutical company, like, in what world would you do it in the local economy if there was an SCZ, right next door, right?
Well, it's not always a good idea to be in a special economic zone. It actually sometimes can be a terrible idea to be in an SEZ. And I'll explain to you why, right? So number one, it depends who your customers are. If you, for example, are doing a cryptocurrency business, well, the regulations of where you're incorporated don't really matter that much. What really matters are how your customers are regulated. In the US, only accredited investors can invest in a lot of securities that are not publicly traded, right? So if you're
Mhm.
dealing with any US or EU investors, you have to follow US and EU law regardless of where you're based. So for a whole bunch of like software businesses, SEZs are just out of the picture, right? A lot of the time, you have to have access to the markets. And if you, for example, are selling widgets in Ireland, you're regulated by Irish consumer protection laws. And even if you're a company in Djibouti or in Myanmar or Lord knows where, you still have to follow the Irish rules. Um, Another reason is political instability. Choosing the wrong zones can get you into a lot of trouble. For example, imagine you're one of the companies that was based in a Colombian special economic zone, and in Colombia they increase the taxes sort of out of the blue. You'd have a lot of problems. Or Mexico shut down its entire zone program totally out of the blue in 2020. So if you pick the wrong zones, you're in a world of pain. And then there's the issue of money laundering and AML compliance. And actually, this is a big issue I'm working on right now, which is posing a headaches to a lot of companies we work with, where there's some zones that for the most part have a 90% legitimate business, and you don't even know it by registering in that zone. But 10% of that zone's business is laundering money. They misuse the legal autonomy they've been granted, and sort of do it for nefarious purposes. And if you're in one of those zones, you could get caught up in your bank account could get automatically flagged for money laundering by the authorities and just shut down, right? So my advice is that special economic zones are great if you have a specific regulatory problem and you're dealing with it. One, two, if you know the country in which you're operating outside of the zone. Three, if you trust the zone and you trust the people who run the zone. No amount of online research or due diligence will even amount to just talking to the people who run the zones and getting a gut check. You can always tell if the people are shady. Like there's a lot of these family-owned SEZs in Central America that I mentioned that are sketchy, but that green park that's run by Grupo Guerrero, I think that those are good people. I doubt you'd get in trouble in a zone like that, but it's more of a gut check thing because you could look at a very similar zone and
Mhm.
get into big trouble. Four is make sure that you actually are going to save money by locating there because real estate prices are higher in the zone than outside of the zone, right? So make sure that you're actually saving more on the regulations than you're spending on the rent. Um, and last is yeah, no, I'd say that's the big thing. So do your homework, know how much you're going to be spending, and be super careful, because you could really get into big trouble if you don't know what you're doing. You're playing with fire. So I'd say that for most people, just incorporate in Delaware or somewhere that's relatively normal and mundane.
Thanks. That's a good summary of potential downsides of the SEs, which helps make a more balanced discussion. So, last wild thought, I'll get your opinion on. This is just very random and wild, but you know how, like on Twitter, people often ask Elon Musk, like, how are we going to organize government on Mars? Like, how are we going to do the Mars thing? What if Mars, we just set it up as a special economic zone?
Okay, are you ready to have your mind blown?
Yep.
Google China Moon Special Economic Zone. The Chinese have announced that when they make their permanent moon base, it's going to be the first extraterrestrial special economic zone on Earth. So who knows?
You're not lying. China proposed as establishing moon-based special economic zone 2019.
Yeah, I've heard.
Should be live by 2050.
I've heard it's a mistranslation of exclusive economic zone, so it's kind of a meme. I don't know if it's real, but there's a lot of people who talk about special economic zones in space. There's a professor who is very well known for writing SEZ legislation, a lawyer called Dr. Michael Castle Miller. I've worked with him closely. If you're starting a new zone, I recommend working with him highly. And he, as a hobby, he's an SEZ lawyer by day, but by night he actually is working with nonprofits to try to find out what the governance aspects of space will be. So I don't know.
Yeah. The first Earth Moon economic zone project could bring in around $10 trillion for China. Blah, blah, blah. I knew I was on something, and I knew that this idea of special economic zones in general are onto something pretty cool. How we can trace the history of it, at least going back like 500 years, and how it's sort of taking on all these different forms. I think it's fair to say these SEZs are going to be around for a long time in one form or another, and I think they're just wildly understudied and underappreciated. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. If you're, and here's a problem. What I found is that academia is wholly unprepared to tackle the issue of special economic zones. Since we've published this data set, I've spoken to almost every major, university researcher working on the SEZ question. And what you find is that they're all obsessed with trying to do statistical comparisons of SEZs. And there's such a diversity of zones, right? How are you going to compare Sauk City to Prospera in Honduras, Sauk City in China, to the Golden Triangle in Laos, to the ecological free zone in Costa Rica, right? That they're comparing apples to potatoes. Also, there's like almost no data that exists. Um, you know, I don't actually think that the economic statistical approach to studying special economic zones yields useful insights. What I think is more helpful is if people looked at case studies starting with the extremes and really studied those. I'm not a big believer in academia and in the ability of universities to do serious research into this type of questions. So sadly, I've had to undertake to do a lot of it myself.
Well, Thibault, you're certainly an encyclopedia of knowledge on special economic zones, just yourself. But then, what you're doing right now in terms of your projects, creating these data sets, the open zone map, etc., startup societies network, all these different projects to sort of open source this data and consolidate it, I think are extremely worthwhile endeavors. There's so many more questions I would have liked to ask you. There's just so many directions you could go with this thing. Maybe I'll have to have some more of your colleagues on the show, maybe some of the Latin America focused guys. And but yeah, I mean, special shout out to Francisco Litve again for helping organize this conversation. And of course, big shout out to Thibault for joining us today all the way from Switzerland. Thibault, so this would be the time in the show where you could sort of direct the audience to anything that you would like to bring attention to, or promote, or get your any final message out.
Sure. So the only social media that I'm on at the moment is LinkedIn, and I respond to 100% of LinkedIn DMs for the time being, and 100% of LinkedIn connections. So just add me, Thibault Serlet, Thibault space Serlet. Also, I recommend checking out openzonemap.com to look at our special economic zone dataset, Adrianople to look at our consulting firm in general. And finally, I'd like to make another announcement. And in about 5 months, we've partnered with the Charter Cities Institute, a nonprofit that studies these new emerging cities. And we're going to be publishing a data set that's about 100 times larger than Open Zone Map, that'll also totally be free and available online. And it's the largest data set in the world on master planned cities, like the capital of Brazil, Brasilia. So that's more of an urbanism rather than SEZ thing. So that's probably it for that. So thank you very much for having me on, Vance.